Hello everyone, Sidewin here. Today I'm recording a short tutorial on how to write in Renpy syntax. Renpy is a popular open source visual novel engine, which is commonly used for smaller projects like game jams. I've worked as an editor, writer, and programmer on several game jam entries over the course of the past year, and I'm familiar with ways to make the process shorter for the end programmer, who is usually the last person to be doing things. So in this video, I'm going to show how writers and editors can reduce the programmer's workload by just writing immediately into the syntax, which can then be copied into the engine. As a note, some modifications may still be required depending on your writing software. A lot of collaborative writing softwares, especially web-based ones, kind of mess up the format, but it's a good way to get started. The other thing I'm going to do is say a little bit about Python syntax, which Renpy is built on. So be prepared for some code examples. For that reason, I am going to change to a monospaced font just so that it's more obvious what the different characters are. So to start, the script I'm going to be using is I'm going to write it here. It's probably going to suck, but it'll give an idea of how this is going to be done. So basically, I'm creating code in a Word document. So I'm going to end up doing these hashtags with, I usually do 2, with the first one being for variables and characters. The hashtags make it so that in Python it's a comment line, meaning that anything on that line will not be sent to the compiler, meaning it won't impact the code at all. Then the second one is I'm going to do a scenes example, and I also usually have a image definition section, but this is a code thing, so it might not apply so much for a writer. So at this point, the first thing to do is to get your characters set up. This is something that a writer can often do fairly easily. The example I'm using is just going to have 2 characters who I'm going to call A and B. So the way that you create a character in Renpy, which means that the line of text will be shown as them speaking it in the lower part of the screen, is you create a short form version of their name. In this case, it's A. And then you type character and parenthesis, quotation mark, and their name. For this example, I'm just going to put Allison. And at this point, you can close parentheses. This makes it so that when you transfer it into the engine, you can call the character. And I'm going to repeat this process with B. Okay, so now I have the 2 characters. I'm going to be instinctively pressing save a lot. You probably won't see it, but it might cause some issues in the recording. Now I'm going to introduce the next thing. So Renpy scripts are usually broken up into scenes. These are basically jump points which you can go between. The way you produce a new scene is by typing label, scene name, and then a colon at the end of the line. And you can call the scene name whatever. The very first scene in any Renpy visual novel is start. So now I'm going to note something about Python syntax which applies. Basically, anything nested inside of another block is part of that block. So for the purpose of writing a scene, everything in that scene should be indented 1 step at least over from the label. So to give an example, you'll note that it's correcting my indents repeatedly. Usually you can set up a writing software to do this quasi-automatically. And I'm just going to do a quick example of how you would write a scene. So first off, if a line has no character saying it, So this is the narrator. You put it just in a set of quotation marks with nothing else. So for this example, you might write, Allison and Beatrice were walking. That will display as one line. Now, if you want another line also to be by the narrator after this, you can just write another one. For example, they saw a tree. This will display on its own segment, showing basically the reader ends up clicking after the walking line and then clicking after the they saw line. And to make things easier, I'm just gonna go through quick and add line numbers so you know what I'm talking about. I leave in some spacing, but I'm not going to put those because it's not really, like, it doesn't actually impact things. I just use it for nicer viewing. So, okay. At this point, there's been 2 lines which the reader can click through. Now, I'm going to add a line where a character says something. So let's say that Allison says, that's a pretty tree. By default, without any other modification, this would be putting it as the narrator of the visual novel saying it. But if you want Allison to say it, you instead write what you created the character abbreviation before. In this case, it's A. So then, assume that the player makes choices for Beatrice. Let's say you want to let them pick what Beatrice says. You can do that with what's called a menu block. You just create it by typing the word menu, and then there's indentation after it. I'll walk through the process of creating it. So I've created the menu. Now on the next line, I'm going to indent over 1 additional space. And for this example, I'm just going to have 2 choices, agree and disagree. I usually type the choices first, but you don't necessarily have to do that. So now there's this additional spacing after these. And to create the actual, like, what happens if you do it, you add an additional indent from the agree. So here, I'm gonna, like, Beatrice agrees, so she says yes, that's pretty. Again, I'm not going for hierarchy here, I'm just going for quick. So then, that happened. And at this point, I know the disagree is going to be line 13, so I'll add that number. And if she disagrees, she's going to say, for example, I think that it's ugly. Again, sucky lines. So to explain how this works, in Python, the indents indicate new blocks. So the menu block is indented 1 over from the start block because it's within the start label. Then the 2 choices are indented over an additional 1 step. And you add colons at the end of menu and each of the choices to indicate that all of them are their own blocks. In base Python, this isn't so much a thing, but you can basically picture it as anything under a block is within it. So it only triggers if the player selects that option. And just to give an example here, if I added on an additional line at the original indent from menu with Allison just saying there's a cat in it, then that will occur no matter what the player says. Basically, my sample menu here is a false choice. The player doesn't actually impact the outcome. Now, what if you actually wanted there to be a choice that impacts things? Well, I'll give the example of another menu. So again, doing the indents. Indents are very important. Remember that your specific doc editor might mess it up. But then, let's say the two choices are we should help it, or, and again, this is my methodology, it'll get down itself. So then on here, line 18 is under the block. I'm going to jump to another block, basically making it so that the end outcome changes. And I'm just going to do jump help cat. So one thing I'm going to note at this point is that variable names in Python have to be one word. There can be no spaces within a variable name. That applies to these A and B. It applies to the start and to help cat. If you have a space in a name, Python is going to interpret that as being two separate statements. So anytime you're changing things, you have to make sure that there are no spaces in the name you use. So now I'm going to put in the second choice, which is, I'll just give the example of it not being a jump. And just have Beatrice say the exact same thing. So now you know that if the player selects that option, you actually don't need to have the statement within the block, because if they choose the other option, they're going to change what scene they're in. So another way you could write this exact same thing is you could de-indent that line back to menu and add an additional line in here, which says pass. This will be basically telling the computer to ignore the line and just keep on going. So now let's say that after that line you want to end the game. The way you do this is just you indent over into the scene in question and write return. This will end the game. But we have that other unaccounted for label. If you tried to run this program within the program, it would fail. So I'm just going to create that second scene. You'll note that this time I'm not doing a full indent. That's because, like the start label, it's under the main program file rather than within the script. So then make sure that the label says the exact same thing. And now I have a new label to write stuff under. So now from here, you have another scene, you've jumped to it, you could return it just here. But I'm going to show one more thing, which is how you would change a variable. So for this, I'm going to go back to the beginning and define a variable. And yes, I'm going to be shifting all the line numbers here in a second. So the variable I'm going to define is I'm just going to put just a generic one, things tried equals 0. And I'm also going to put a $sign at the start of this line. So in Renpy, what a $sign means is that this line is a Python statement. That means that you can use everything in the language. So now I'm going to go through and update all the line numbers because I added one earlier. An actual programming engine will do this for you. I actually debated just using my development screen, but realistically, if you're the writer and just trying to make things easier, you're not going to want to open the coding engine, and you probably won't even be given access to the code. But now we have that variable of things tried, and I initially set it to 0. So what I'm going to do here is somewhat more complicated. Basically, imagine you set up a loop. A loop means that you return to the location until all options have been resolved or the player decides to ignore. So then at this point, the way I'm going to just put the scene is, for instance, Beatrice says we need to help it, and Allison adds on how. Let's say you're going to give the player an option of how they help the cat. So for that, you have another menu block. And for this menu, I'm going to just put a few different options. For instance, grab a ladder, get a food bowl. Yes, again, I know this sucks. And then the last one, I'll just put it as call the fire department or decide against it. And I'm going to indent each of these out so I don't lose my place on that. So now, for each of these, I'm going to, as the writer, you will not do this, but as the programmer, they'll add an option to gray it out as these options have been selected. For this, the programmer will likely set up a few more variables. However, I wouldn't expect any writer to do this, so I'm not going to cover it in this video. But under each of these, I'm going to jump to a scene. And you'll note here that technically the player could go back to these options, but I'll explain how I'm going to go here in a minute. And this time, even though technically if you pick decide to do nothing, you'll just continue on through, I'm going to still have it jump to another label. So to keep going here, if I'm just coding quick, I'll write each of the labels so that I don't forget I did them. And then I'm also going to toss one more label here at the bottom, which I'm going to call select. This is a coder thing, and technically you don't have to do this. So then under ladder, I'm just going to put one line of, like, you grab a ladder. And then at the end of this, I'm going to jump to the select screen. Just label these lines quick. Then under food bowl, I'm just going to put exact same thing and then jump to select screen again. On this one, I'm not going to jump back to the select screen. I'm going to give the example of another branch. Let's say the characters get in trouble. I'm just going to call this, call fire dep. So one thing I'll note here is generally in programming, you do not want variable names to start with numbers because the majority of programming languages prohibit it. I just don't remember the exact rule of Python at this moment, so I wouldn't try it. Then I'm going to add that label just so that it's there. Then under do not, it's going to finish the game because presumably the player clicks it after they've tried everything, and just put the cat gets itself down. And at this point, I'm going to put another return statement. So then if the player gets here, then the game will end. Now for the select screen. The way I'm going to implement this is just list the three options again. Basically, I'm going to just copy paste this menu. And as the writer, that's all you have to do. The programmer will add in the if nots to make sure that these scenes can't trigger repeatedly. The way you would actually do that, if anyone's interested, I can explain in another video. So then for this last one, this will probably be the final scene I put in this example. I'm just going to put you get in trouble. And also return the game here. So now to go back through the script, which is fairly short, I'll explain the couple of things that if you did this as a writer would make it quicker. First off, the scenes are labeled and you have clear jumps marked. By clearly indicating the jumps, you allow the programmer to basically just copy-paste exactly what's in the script. This means that when you give it to them, they can usually get the base script in quickly. The couple of things you did not put in here, which they will be adding, are those variables, like on the select menu example. These options should be grayed out over time. Generally, the way a programmer will do that is by adding variable flags to say if you've taken a certain option or not. However, doing this still saves time. I highly recommend that if you regularly write for Renpy projects, you do this in your script. If you don't feel like you understand this fully, feel free to ask me again. I'm willing to answer any questions in the comments. And if you have any additional things you'd like me to demonstrate, feel free. I apologize again for the cruddy script and the slightly awkward way I did this. I did not plan ahead of time, and I did not want to type into Engine immediately because the majority of writers never get access. Thank you for watching. Always feel free to ask questions.